My name's Joyce Klein Rosenthal, and I'm taking over as MC from Radley. Thank you, Radley. I'm delighted to introduce the group, mywoodlot.com, protecting water quality and promoting sustainable forest management in the New York City watershed. Thanks.
So our project was working with the Watershed Agricultural Council, which is a nonprofit organization that works to sort of ensure the water quality that New York is getting maintains its sustainability and quality. If you don't know, New York City tap water is great. I think the other group just did a great job explaining that, but that's because it comes from a couple of watersheds primarily north of the city, namely the Croton Watershed and the Catskill, Delaware Watershed. The Watershed Agricultural Council is particularly focusing on the Croton Watershed, which is primarily forested, and much of that forested land is owned by private landowners, which means a lot of the decisions they make directly impact the quality of our water. And so what the Watershed Agricultural Council, or WAC as we might refer to it, does is they're trying to reach these landowners to make sure they are encouraging the best stewardship practices to maintain that forested land so that it can continue to do its job of filtering the water for us, so we don't have to invest and maintain in large-scale filtration plants. And one of the things they sort of posed to us as an issue for them is reaching the landowners, so they wanted to better understand their target community and how to best approach them to improve their completion of these goals.
The first step in our methodology was to take a site visit and interact with landowners who were selected by the Watershed Agricultural Council. It was really helpful to be able to speak to them, to see their land, have them give us tours of their land and hear about their environmental values. This really informed our survey methods later on in the project because we were able to identify things that might be relevant to ask them about and then report back to WAC. We wanted to help these landowners not only enjoy their land, but also take care of it for everyone's benefit. And through WAC, the mywoodlot.com tool is to serve as a resource to these landowners so that they can better understand the needs of their land and ways that they can take care of it. So through our survey, we aimed to enable them to get those resources, not through just Google searches and asking people when they had specific questions, but establishing mywoodlot.com as a resource that they could consistently refer to.
All right, so as Paulina and Annette talked about, we were tasked with conducting an interview study with landowners in the Croton area watershed, specifically on the east side of the Hudson River. That was our sample. So WAC sent out a hard copy mailer to a random sample of landowners, and those landowners voluntarily could send back a postcard to choose to participate in the survey. So we conducted a semi-structured interview. We developed an interview guide that we administered over the phone in a 30 to 50-minute interview to these landowners. We recorded these interviews with verbal consent and transcribed them afterwards. We used an interview guide on Google Forms that had both open-ended questions and Likert scale questions, which are scaled responses from 1 to 5. After we conducted those interviews and transcribed them, we used keyword coding and key phrase coding techniques to analyze the qualitative data, and we used NVivo qualitative data analysis software to do so. It was really important to us to follow best practices in human subjects research, which, among other things, included maintaining confidentiality by using all encrypted softwares and recording devices, and establish intercoder reliability, so we had multiple people code each transcript to eliminate chance of bias. So some of the kind of topical findings that we had, we identified 5 common themes in our results. So those were enjoyment of the land, a desire to preserve the land, nature and wildlife, an orientation towards family, and the most prominent one was the limited knowledge of the Watershed Agricultural Council, which was our client, which we'll talk a little bit about in a minute. And you can see this word cloud just was generated from word frequency from our transcripts, so you can see the themes that were most important to our landowners a little bit more visually laid out.
In addition to questions that talked about values and land ownership, we also collected demographic data, which is really helpful in our recommendations to the Watershed Agricultural Council. We found that retirees reported fewer current projects and longer land ownership, and that was especially relevant because over 50% of the sample we interviewed was over 66 years old. And overall, 80% of those we interviewed had not heard of or interacted with mywoodlot.com or the Watershed Agricultural Council in general. So that showed us the need to recommend that WAC push for greater marketing and visibility as it relates to their entire organization and specifically to their tool.
We also surveyed their information preferences to see if there's some ways that WAC could be better reaching these people. We found mainly that social media was really not preferred, perhaps because this is an older community that we're talking to. There were sort of varied preferences in terms of email or like hard copy mail, perhaps because you had some who preferred one and some who preferred the other, so they kind of evened each other out. However, websites and community events scored well, and experts and professionals were generally trusted for specific events that one might need to go out and find information for directly regarding to their land.
So this is the results of our coding. You can see that we have a series of key themes that we derived both from the My Woodlot website, which were the themes that they advertised the most on their website, and also themes that came up a lot in our interviews. And you can see those across the top, as well as the participant ID numbers along the side. And it's coded according to frequency of appearance in the transcript. So you can see the darker shaded colors over there for the themes family, enjoyment, and wildlife were the most frequent and the most important to our participants, whereas the lighter shaded colors over here, which are taxes and finance, government involvement, and safety, were some of the least important to our landowners. Now that's really interesting because WAC actually prioritizes things like taxes and finance, government, safety, and preservation on their website more so than enjoyment, wildlife, and family. So it seems like there was a bit of an inverse in what landowners actually were interested in versus what WAC was marketing. Yeah.
And so with that in mind, we were able to, after everything was said and done, we realized that we had some key challenges with our landowner survey. One, the low response rate, which has to do in large part with the ways in which the Watershed Agricultural Council reached out to landowners, but also with their reach and the rate at which people are able to engage with them and recognize them. Also, as Annette said, the lack of response from pre-retirement landowners. So that led to a two-pronged readjustment of our mission statement. We realized that since local landowners are unfamiliar with the Watershed Agricultural Council, they don't necessarily engage with their material. So that indicates a really first important issue to address. But then also we realize that those who do engage with the Watershed Agricultural Council do so principally through their website and programming, but that those who do spend time on their website on average spend about 45 seconds, which is not very much time at all, and it's hard to be able to receive quality information in that time. So that suggested a usability issue with their website, My Woodlot specifically. And so we decided to undertake some usability testing. For those of you who don't know, usability testing is the process of assessing the extent to which a product or feature addresses and fulfills its intended purpose with the humans, the users, in mind. So with that in mind, we created 3 guiding questions. We were focused on what aspects of the site work well, most importantly, which are in need of improvement. We wondered at how the users respond to the layout specifically, and to what extent, as I mentioned, the site fulfills its intended purpose. In order to conduct this usability testing, we created a framework that had a multi-step framework that would hope to help us triangulate results and get a lot of good information in different ways. First, we asked users to create an account on the site to assess, whether users felt that it was worthwhile to create an account for continued use. We also had an information scavenger hunt in which we asked users to see if they could find information on taxes, on invasive species, for instance. Then finally, we did a comparison with the New York Audubon Society site, which has a similar intended purpose, and then that culminated with an exit survey that was very similar to our interview guide. And this is a screenshot from the My Woodlot page. Some of the feedback that we got was specifically regarding the navigation bar at the top of the page. Users did not feel that the organization was very intuitive, and so that was one of our main recommendations for changes. Also, as Mira's coding revealed, we realized that there is a discrepancy between the most important aspects of land ownership and the ones that My Woodlot advertises, specifically leaving a legacy, reducing taxes, pests, and privacy and trespassing were not concerns, and beauty and scenery and nature and wildlife were of concern, but there was a conflation between those two categories. People were confused. Basically, the strengths were that there was a highly visual layout and there was a wide range of content.
Yeah, so our recommendations to WAC moving forward are for them to continue studies and interviews, as we were limited by sort of sample size and the type of sample that was responding, but to use that to inform improvements in usability, prioritizing values in terms of content creation, and increasing their marketing and outreach to their target community. So are there any questions? Thank you.
Thank you very much. You talked about the sample size being an issue. I was wondering how many exactly people you interviewed and what that represents for the whole Croton Watershed.
Yeah. I believe they sent out 175 hard copy mailers. I think we got about 15 responses.
Yeah, so we got there was about 20 people who responded to the mailer, and then we weren't able to establish contact with them. Either didn't receive emails back, didn't receive phone calls back. We ended up having 10 full interviews that we were able to conduct out of 150 mailer postcards that were sent out to that sample.
Thanks, that was really impressive. How many, the pre-retirement cohort that you mentioned was difficult to reach, given that they probably will be there longer, how do you think they can be reached?
I mean, this is more conjecture, hypothesis. I would suspect they might be more receptive to things like social media. So WAC might want to target them by that route, even though we found that they weren't quite receptive in the retirement community. It's still something we should explore further.
Also targeting community centers and areas in which people come together, namely schools and community centers, libraries. That would be a really effective strategy, given that a lot of people, because the tracts of land are relatively large and people don't necessarily live very close to each other, those we spoke to did mention that they really looked forward to engaging with the community within dedicated spaces.
What about geographic biases? Do you think there are issues that would be different between Croton and the Catskills versus regions within each of the watersheds that would be specific regionally?
Yeah, so that is something that the scope of our project this year didn't address, because we were asked specifically to look at the east side of the watershed, and last year they looked at the west side. For the Capstone project, they worked with WAC as well and worked with the west side, and some differences even in that were that on the west side of the watershed, it's mainly non-resident landowners, so people who live in Manhattan, for example, and travel up there for summer or on the weekends. And so already there's a little bit of bias in how much people are engaged with their land. People on the east side are generally more engaged with their land, more present, doing more current projects or activities on their land because they live there full time, whereas in other areas of the watershed, there are more people who live there only certain times of the year. And also, generally, there's difference in socioeconomic status between the different watersheds, so that also could come into play.
What kind? Sorry. What kind of projects tend to impact water quality?
I know some of the things WACS tends to like try to educate about or talk about things like pest control, ways to do that in effective ways that don't lead to pollution or runoff, tree removal or foliage removal. I guess not limited to trees are ways to effectively do that without causing any damage. Do you guys have anything to add?
Also, like a lot of people, well, a few people that we interviewed expressed interest in building a cabin on their property or a patio or something like that, which would definitely increase the amount of impervious surfaces for one,
Right.
would also change the ways in which the land is situated, the way that groundwater filters down into the land. So yeah, basically just anything that you do with your land in close proximity to a wetland can and most likely will affect that wetland
Right.
in some way.
Hi. Does WAC tell these landowners anything about what's going to happen with climate change or how the land is going to change?
As far as their content seems to be geared towards right now, I haven't seen so much on that. It seems to be focused more on day-to-day life because I feel like that's what they perceive and I think rightly so to an extent, the concerns of landowners are more day-to-day, especially in terms of like projects they might be working on or concerns they have with their property. And I think there's a chance to educate the public in that sense, but I think they're still trying to just reach the public to a larger extent right now. That's like their primary goal.
That being said, because so many of these retirees had lived there for a really long time, several of them were able to
Right.
mention like, I have definitely noticed changes in the flora and fauna on my property,
Right.
and we're very concerned about that. So one of our recommendations also were to find ways to engage with those specific interests in a way that would be more beneficial.
Thank you.